All right, well, let's talk about last night's elections, and I want to do so in a fairly reasonable and balanced manner because, as I'm sure you know by now, Democrats swept essentially all major elections in New Jersey, Virginia, New York City, and California. Now, on one hand, many Democrats are using that as clear proof that, look, we dominated, this is a referendum moment, and therefore we're going to sweep 2026 and the future. On the other hand, many Republicans are pointing out that, well, you sort of won a bunch of elections in deep blue states. Does that really mean anything? I think the truth on that is somewhere in the middle. On one hand, yes, it is not necessarily, for reasons we'll explain, the referendum on Trump or national Republicans in the way that these Democrats believe. On the other hand, I do see the same institutional problems in Republican-ran campaigns that are popping up time and time again, whether it comes to poor candidate selection or the lack of a ground game, right, which ultimately translates into the lack of turnout and energy on the Republican side in non-presidential elections. You saw this in the 2022 midterms. You saw this in many of the special elections under Biden. And when you break down the math, right, you clearly saw that again last night. Here's the good news. If the RNC gets its blank together, then this is an easily correctable issue. After all, we corrected it more than enough in 2024. But if not, then that is inevitably, right, going to be the same picture that you see over and over again. But we'll break down all of this stuff here in today's video. I further think that the government shutdown certainly was a dirty tactic by Democrats to make sure their voter base showed up. Immigration and, the movement of people across states, even internally, in the United States, definitely has factors to play in this as well, but we'll bring you all of that analysis today. In this video, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the Virginia and New Jersey races because I do want to sort of dedicate my own content to New York City. That's a whole different monster, a whole different animal, but we'll briefly talk about that as well. So let's get into all of this, guys. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new. That is not only the best way to support our work, but it also ensures that you can stay up to date with all of the latest news and coverage. And with that said, I would like to start by talking about the Virginia governor's race because I actually think it's the easiest one to understand, and then you can sort of translate that logic to everything else you saw in the other states. Because you're talking about a race here where, to be honest with you, I never felt great about all year for a couple different reasons. First and foremost, back earlier in 2025 was, of course, the DOGE cuts. You're talking about a state where there's a high population of federal workers, especially in places such as Loudoun and Fairfax County, Virginia, right? Basically around Arlington, the DC suburbs. And certainly that was going to have an impact all along. Now, we do also know what Democrats did right before these off-year elections, which was shut down the government. And so as a result of that, they left all of these federal workers without having a job to do, right? Basically, the only thing they had to do was go out and vote. And yes, never mind the fact that the Democrats are literally the ones responsible for shutting down the government. We know how the leanings, right, of federal workers and government bureaucrats always has been. And that definitely is a factor that you saw, I think, across this state. And that was always going to be a disadvantage for Republicans in Virginia. That said, this is not a picture that necessarily can translate nationwide because you're not talking about places in other of the actual swing states that have nearly the same population of these federal workers. But with that in mind, I do not think that is the only explanation because this is the swing map, by the way, basically showing as compared to 2024 and Donald Trump, how the Republican Winsome Sears here performed. And you definitely see that picture, right? This is certainly government shutdown related. In Loudoun County, they went 12 points more Democratic than the 2024 presidential vote. In Arlington County, 8.8 points more Democratic than 2024. And over here in Fairfax County, if we can find it, but if not, yeah, it's basically the same picture, 11 points more Democratic. But that said, does this completely exonerate the Republican performance of Winsome Sears? I don't think that is the case, and let me tell you why. Because you also notice in the rural parts of the state, it's the same exact picture, right? All of these smaller, less populated counties that are historically more Republican, when you look at the swing, right? For example, Harrisonburg, 15 points more Democratic. Waynesboro, 10 points more Democratic. In other words, both the urban centers and the rural parts of the state shifted heavily to the Democrats. Now, again, we already explained what's happening in the urban centers, and certainly that's something you just could not get around. But in the rural Republican areas, what was going on there? Are we to believe that they all magically turn into Democrats overnight? Or does it seem much more likely that, again, the lack of turnout and enthusiasm and energy was there from Winsome Sears to get a lot of the low propensity, less engaged voters who lean Republican to show up to the ballot box? I think that is also something that needs to be considered, right? Winsome Sears, I have nothing against her. But the truth of the matter is she always kind of went in this as a weak candidate. Her campaign was way underfunded, under-resourced. Let me just say she's not the political dynamo that Glenn Youngkin was. And I think that's something also that you saw in those results, which is, again, why you have to look at it and say Republican turnout is so important. Because one thing you're not going to be able to get around in 2026 is that the Democrats are energized, right? No kings, no kings. They can't stand Donald Trump. Heck, they might do another government shutdown by that time to try to get this turnout to work again, because after all, you can see it was pretty effective. The only answer we can have is that our people need to show up to the polls. But as you can see, that is not what happened here either. Now, that said, let us shift this conversation here to talk about the election of Jay Jones, right? This is perhaps the most disappointing and frankly appalling result of the night, which is that the violent Democrat AG candidate, right? The one who fantasized about killing Republicans and even seeing their children die in school shootings, right? Absolutely unhinged lunatic, as a result, did end up winning over Jason Miyares by a margin of, actually, in the end, it's looking like over 5 points and about 200,000 or so raw votes here. Now, look, you could easily sit there and say that in any normal context of American politics, Jay Jones should have immediately been disqualified. Doesn't matter how deep blue the state is, right? This type of lunatic should not be winning. But after all, the referendum on that is what? What are Democrats saying to you? The overwhelming majority, as we've talked about before, by the way, we talked about this when breaking down the polls when it came to political assassinations. We talked about this when it came to the amount of Democrats openly celebrating the death of Charlie Kirk. Yes, that absolutely did happen. And what did they say again last night? Yes, we by high numbers do support political violence, which to some degree I'm not calling for anything, but that does have to make you lose a little bit of faith in a democratic solution to what America is facing, is it not? I mean, how can you have a functioning pluralistic quote unquote democracy? I understand it's a republic, but still any system that provides representation to the people when like half of the pluralistic group basically is fine with murdering the other half, that is certainly toxic and terrible. But again, it shouldn't surprise you that most of the Democrats, minus maybe a 10 to 20 or so sane percentage, the minority of the party who actually has some degree of like humanity, I guess, left inside of them, that, yeah, still a bunch of Democrats were going to show up to vote for Jay Jones. That said, I think it's very important to point this out, is that when it comes to these down ballot candidates, right? Winsome Sears versus Abigail Spanberger, the governor's race is at the top of the ticket. You can only ask a down ballot candidate like Jason Miyares to do so much, right? With such a weak top of the ticket carrying it. What do we mean by that? So when you look at, for instance, the margins, at least currently with most of the votes in today, of the Virginia governor's race, where Abigail Spanberger dominated Winsome Sears by like 15 points, right? 57 to 42. And you consider that, again, we just established in these red counties, Winsome Sears got a very poor turnout. Not a lot of Republicans were even showing up because they were not energized, or heck, maybe some didn't know a freaking election was happening or didn't care. I mean, that's absolutely possible. That when the electorate is this blue, you cannot expect Miyares to pick up all that weight and carry it, right? That's why having a strong candidate at the top of your ticket is so important going forward. Because as you can see right here, Miyares ended up getting 47% of the vote. So he outperformed the top of the ticket, right, the governor's candidate, by about 5 points. By all accounts, if you outrun the Republican by 5, that is a pretty solid overall performance. But the problem is what? When Sears is losing by like 15, how much can you expect them to pull that weight? So again, two things are true. Yes, it was not disqualifying for most Democrats. This is something we already well established. On the other hand, the real blame here also ought to go to not Sears personally necessarily, but overall, right, that campaign for failing to get the rest of the people to show up. Because let's be honest, when you go to vote, are you really caring about the attorney general's race? Is that enough to make you actively show up? Or is it honestly something, right, you're really going there to vote for governor? I think that is very important also to keep in mind. But yeah, this is obviously a tragic and horrific situation. And again, it makes you question a little bit whether the country can sustain with attitude like this from Democrat voters. But again, guys, shouldn't at the same time be all that surprising. Now, that said, I do also want to talk here now about New Jersey. Because having established the core themes here, again, government shutdown, big thing to do with it. High Democrat energy, not enough Republican energy, big thing to do with it. I think you saw a similar picture, right? Now, you might ask what exactly, has to do, for instance, with, say, the government shutdown here. Well, it's worth noting, we're not just talking about federal workers. Think about the EBT recipients, right? All the people who are historically Democrats for obvious reasons, right? Because the Democrats are the party of their quote unquote free money. And there was all the talk. Some of them did lose SNAP. Some of them were looking like they were going to lose it. And Ryan, our numbers guy, basically brought this up last night. But in a place like Cumberland County, if I'm not mistaken, that's the correct county here, which is the poorest in all of New Jersey, right? Has the highest poverty rate. This is something that Ciattarelli, I believe, won outright, if I'm not mistaken, last time. You can see was won here narrowly by Mikie Sherill. Again, talk about government shutdown. Talk about EBT. What do you think is going on there? And it is a sad reality, frankly, but it's also a truth we have to recognize. When it came to the creation of the modern welfare state by FDR and LBJ, okay, did you really think they ever thought it was actually a good idea, morally speaking, I guess you could say, right? You don't think they knew they were going to be creating a huge generation of dependents? Of course they could. The entire point is much like a drug that you're addicted to. When you get addicted to free handouts and government benefits, it is very hard to wean people off of that, even when, for instance, your life would be better if you actually got out of poverty. But right, that comfort, that dependence, the withdrawal effect is kind of nasty or hard at the beginning. They don't want to deal with that. And so that's obviously another picture and another way in which essentially Democrats used a dirty trick against us. But again, that's not the only explanation, because as Mark Mitchell of Rasmussen points out, and this is going back once again to that conversation about the Republican turnout and lack of energy on our side, Mikie Sherill, guys, got 89% of Kamala Harris's turnout in 2024, right? So basically almost all, because keep in mind, it's an off-year election, it's not presidential, not as many people care. Almost the entire Democrat voter base came out to vote. Ciattarelli, despite the fact, honestly, I thought he ran a good campaign. He was trying his best, but I don't know how the ground game was, for instance. I know it's 2025. A lot of people think, oh, podcasts are enough. No, you still got to knock doors. You still got to do all the conventional campaign stuff. You still got to be engaging and actively calling and trying to target, right, those low propensity voters. Well, Ciattarelli only got 70% of Trump's 2024 turnout. In other words, 30% of the Republican constituency, the voter base, stayed home. Almost none of the Democrats did. You look at this result where we were expecting this to be a razor close race. In the end, Mikie Sherill ended up dominating it by 13 points. I mean, there's your answer. The Republican voters simply were not there. Granted, I'm sure some of them have left Jersey over the years to go to red states, go to Florida, other places. At the same time, it's only a year since 2024 where Trump lost that state, I should say, by only 6 points. So yeah, certainly that is a factor too that we have to talk about. So again, guys, when it comes to 2026, what is the key theme we're going to have to keep going back to? Turnout, turnout, turnout. Republican voters, I don't know how you do it, but they have to care about the smaller elections. You just have to show up to vote. That's the biggest picture I see here, right? A lot of Democrats are going to say, oh, clearly it's a referendum against Trump. People are unhappy about that. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure that played a part in, some of the more, for instance, Hispanic districts up in North Jersey, right? I'm sure, hey, maybe the ICE raids were disaffecting some people. I'm sure, by the way, when it comes to independent voters, the economy could be a factor. Now, that said, I think the economy over the time of Trump's presidency will get better. I said even before he was inaugurated, I think 2025 is going to be a slow economic year because the COVID bubble is basically bursting, right? Although the fake stimulus money, all the artificial boosts in tourism and consumption is slowing down, right? So it's going to be kind of like a mini recession, and then we'll have a recovery period when Trump sort of reorients the economic approach. So I'm not worried about that component necessarily, unless Trump doesn't manage to get the economy back on track. But sure, those could all be factors too. Don't get me wrong, right? So definitely in the future, hopefully that is something that is not working against us, because again, we're still in a recovery period. But with all of that said, okay, you cannot ignore the core fact of this, which is that, in the end, when you really break it down, no, what happened is that the Republican voters didn't show up. And it's disappointing, and it happens time and time again. Now, that said, last point here I do want to bring up is also the question that we also should confront as the conservative movement, which is, of course, immigration itself and the impact this is further having on changing the electorate in many of these key states that, of course, we know the left is right, importing their own voter base. And I think a video like this right here is actually a prime example of exactly the theme we are talking about. Take a listen.
I always vote since I became a citizen, and that was 20 years ago. And I migrated from Kenya originally. My family is back home in Kenya, and how I see how things are going on, like with families being separated, as a human being, as a mother, separating families, especially children, from their mothers or fathers. I don't believe in that. So that made me come out and also come and vote.
So that's one big issue. Another one is the government shutdown. Tens of thousands of government workers live here in Loudoun County.
Right, and that is something that is happening en masse across the country. Because, look, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of legal immigrants who vote Republican. But statistically speaking, it is not the majority. As a matter of fact, it is a very small minority of that. And you can look at her and say, and try to explain it on the issues, like, look, you're a legal immigrant, you're a U.S. citizen, the ICE raids are targeting illegal aliens, you're not in that camp, you shouldn't care about that, it's not your issue. But at the same time, do we really think that it comes down to some type of good faith debate? Or she's just naive about that? Or do you think it's much more accurate that en masse the left, through the immigration system, both illegal and legal, en masse, right, it's about the numbers overall, is basically importing their voter base? And unless we get control of immigration and essentially stop the left from constantly importing their own voter base, they're going to keep on winning, right? As Stephen Miller says right here, understand what our immigration system has done to us. See, you can believe in the archetype or dream of legal immigration, which is that, oh, we're going to bring in people who genuinely love this country and contribute and all that stuff. But as we've been trying to talk about a lot lately, again, we're not singling people out. We're not saying it's all of them, but en masse, right? And it should make sense to you, considering much like the modern welfare state, the modern legal immigration system was also constructed by Democrat LBJ, who was basically a power-hungry sociopath that wanted to permanently terraform the country in his party's political favor. That, no, this is en masse, right? Kind of the result that you're seeing. Now, I do think that New York City is perhaps the most glaring example of this. But it's not alone, right? We know that immigration has changed basically every state in this country. And is that happening to the benefit of conservatives or to the detriment? I think you know the answer. And again, that's their whole plan here, right? And so that's why I've been saying as of late, I am a single issue voter when it comes to immigration. It's the most important thing, right? Because every other issue, understand, is downstream of that. It doesn't matter how many hearts and minds you win over. It doesn't matter how many universities and institutions that you unwokeify. It doesn't matter even if legal immigrants over time start to shift towards the Republicans, like, for instance, a lot of the Hispanic population, say, did in 2024. If the left, it doesn't matter how many kids you have either, by the way. If the left keeps importing their voter base, they're always going to keep on outnumbering people because they'll just accelerate it more. You have to cut that off in order to have a chance, right, to have anything to do in terms of, rescuing the country. And a prime example of this comes out of the New York City mayoral election exit poll that basically asks here, how long have you been in New York City? Zohran Mamdani obviously won the mayorship last night, as we expected. Of those born in New York City, Andrew Cuomo won 50% of the vote. Mamdani won only 38%. So if we were to talk about, quote unquote, real New Yorkers, right, those who were born in the city, raised in the city, and you ask the question, some people nationwide, what's going on with the New Yorkers? Well, it's not the New Yorkers. The New Yorkers did not elect Mamdani. They did not vote for Mamdani. But guess what? Of those in New York City who have lived here for less than 5 years, Mamdani, guess what, wins that 85% to Cuomo's only 14%. You wonder where his margins came from? It's not coming from New Yorkers, it's coming from non-New Yorkers. Now, don't get me wrong, there's two pictures to that, right? On one hand, you got to talk about even internal US transplants, right? A lot of the college kids who come over to study, they're basically coming to New York because they're like progressive socialistic people, right? A lot of the younger crowd who's maybe moving to New York City for work, living in Manhattan, sure. But at the same time, yes, a big component of that also, yes, is immigration, because where the question is what? People not born in New York City. And perhaps the greater picture you frankly saw overall is that because Andrew Cuomo essentially, and the Democrats as a whole, right, essentially terraformed a place like New York City to be permanently Democratic, right? Whether that was opening the borders over time, which they did for many years, or that was simply driving all of the Republican voters out of the state with, say, for instance, the insane COVID policies. Guys, it all adds up to ultimately produce the result you just saw right there. So, for instance, when people ask a question I've been seeing floated a lot, which is, what happened to never forget 9/11, right? How could New York City surrender to this? Well, that is because the population of New York City is much different today than it was in 2001. That's your prime example. As it turns out, native-born New Yorkers actually did not forget 9/11. The whole point is they've brought people into the city who never remembered it or never knew about it or at least witnessed it right firsthand to begin with. So I think these are really the important conversations that ought to be had in the conservative movement going forward. On the micro, when it comes to Republican campaigns, you gotta chase turnout. You gotta knock those doors. You gotta have the ground game, right? And we have to have the same resources that match the Democrats. A lot of people were telling me in the live chat last night, hey, I live in New Jersey. It was all Mikie Sherill ads. I live in Virginia. It was all Abigail Spanberger ads. Yeah, I mean, that's what happens, right? At the same time, again, that topic of immigration, I think, cannot be ignored, right? New York City, biggest example, but again, not the only example here. And perhaps lastly, when it comes to maybe the message that Democrats, for instance, sent us with electing Jay Jones and being unapologetic about it, is we also have to have a sobering reality of what we're really up against in this country, right? These are like insane, power-hungry lunatics. They're perfectly fine with violence, and you cannot sit there and treat that as some type of 1970s, 1980s style, like, I don't know, civil debate, right? Again, not calling for violence, but it is to say, when it comes to wielding political power, you have to be ready to do it in the maximum direction. Because as you can see, the Democrats are freaking crazy. So if you don't stop them, right, not violently, but politically, then you're going to have Jay Jones is basically running the country. Prime example of this theme, by the way, California Prop 50. You just saw this yesterday, and it's not surprising, but of course, that did pass, right? California will now be gerrymandering their map even more in favor of the Democrats. And I'm not surprised by that, right? Because after all, we understand Gavin Newsom, but Democrats as a whole are, yes, power-hungry, cynical, sociopathic lunatics. They don't really freaking care. And so they're all there for the power grab. At the same time, you can't really blame them because this is the political party that will say vehemently, we don't care if it's Jay Jones. We're still going to vote for this person because he's advancing our cause. And ultimately, they understand, right, that the end goal is victory. That's the most important thing to them. Because you don't have victory, you can't implement any of your ideas, obviously, right? They understand that when it comes to an issue like congressional redistricting, it's all a freaking power grab on both sides. And so they're going to do the maximum power grab. That said, what are Republicans doing right now in response? Well, we did get good news today out of Kansas, for instance, saying that they still plan on doing redistricting in 2026. That's good. But we also just saw recently that the rhinos in the Indiana state legislature said they're not going to do redistricting because, our principles or something like this. Absolute freaking cowards. These people just passed that in California. They just elected Jay Jones, and you're like, I don't know if gerrymandering is very morally correct. Okay, but the other side is freaking doing it. So either stand there on your principles and let Jay Jones freaking blank you, right? Or like grow a spine and do something. Same thing in Ohio. They just passed a redistricting map there, the Republicans did, but it was basically a dummy mander, right? It might not even add a single Republican seat in the end when we could have added from anywhere from 3 to 5 there. Total disappointment. So that's the other part of this, right? A lot of the Democrat voter base is saying to their own politicians, we got to fight harder. No, but in all seriousness, like on an actual level, right? Republicans on some of these issues also have to fight harder. Don't be surprised that California passed redistricting in a blue state. You got to do it in the red states. It comes down to that, right? But, there's sort of my key takeaways again. And also, let me just lastly say, when it comes to, for instance, immigration, that's another reason why I would argue when people say, oh, maybe the ICE raids are going too far. No, you need to understand, you will not have a country left if we do not solve immigration. So even if it makes us politically unpopular, which I think is only a short-term effect and maybe overblown, okay? But still, right? No, understand, unless you stop the left from importing its voter base, doesn't matter how good you make the economy, they're going to keep on freaking winning. And that's very important to understand. But all right, all of that said, guys, initial thoughts. Again, we'll talk more about this throughout today. Zohran Mamdani will delve much more deeper into that and all that. But that said, guys, let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comment section down below. And until next time, God bless and peace.